here who hasn't seen Jim Acosta face off against Donald Trump over the past few years? That's what I thought. Clearly, Jim, in his role as CNN's chief White House correspondent, has become, as NPR called him, the most visible reporter to regularly spar with the president. In his new memoir, I gather you all approve, right? In his new memoir, The Enemy of the People, Jim recounts the challenges of reporting on this president and his team amid Trump's many attacks on the press and on Jim personally, and CNN especially, as purveyors of fake news and the enemy of the people. Such attacks have had pernicious effects, precipitating death threats against Jim, angry chants by Trump supporters at political rallies, and unexploded pipe bombs delivered to CNN headquarters. But at the same time, Jim also has garnered his share of praise from those who regard his pushing back against Trump as an admirable, courageous, and necessary response. Jim's most famous confrontation with Trump, as many of you no doubt know, came last year when Jim declined to cede the microphone to another reporter during a press briefing. The White House revoked his press pass. CNN went to court to get it back and won. Now, it's a basic principle among many reporters that they're not supposed to become part of the story. And Jim writes that he shares this belief. But he argues that Trump represents a new, more disturbing kind of president who requires a different kind of playbook for journalists, one that involves not simply asking questions, but fighting for the truth. Neutrality for the sake of neutrality, Jim contends, doesn't really serve us in the age of Trump. Critics have accused Jim of going too far, crossing the line between reporting and offering opinions, even grandstanding, a criticism that Jim addresses in his book, defending his approach. In any case, looking back at Jim's career, he undeniably has worked his way up, earning his current position of prominence. He grew up in the D.C. area, and after college began his journalism career in radio with WMAL-AM here, then moved to TV 25 years ago. He reported for stations in Knoxville, Dallas, and Chicago before becoming, in 2001, a correspondent with CBS's NewsPath, the network's 24-hour news service. Then 2 years later, he became a correspondent for CBS News. He joined CNN in 2007, and 5 years after that, was promoted to the position of national political correspondent. He became chief White House correspondent at the start of last year. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Jim Acosta.
I've got nothing left to say now. Is this you guys can hear me okay? This is on and everything? No, it's not. It's not. How about now? Check, check, 1, 2. Okay. I'm very defensive of microphones, and I want to make sure that they're working, so on. Now that I've gotten that terrible joke out of the way, thanks everybody for coming here tonight. And I guess maybe the more surprising thing that was mentioned just a few moments ago, and thanks for having me here at Politics and Prose, is that I am a native of the Washington, D.C. area. And there aren't many of those folks out there. There aren't many folks like myself. And I'm a proud Washingtonian, a proud native of this area. I grew up in Northern Virginia. How you guys? I'm seeing some friendly, familiar faces here. I was born at Fairfax County Hospital. I went to Annandale High School over there in Fairfax County. Went to James Madison University. It's pretty Virginian. It's about as Virginian as it gets. My parents, they did the best they could with me. My dad is a Cuban immigrant, as some of you may know. He came over to this country in 1962, 3 weeks before the Cuban Missile Crisis. First moved to Miami, or migrated to Miami, and then came up to Northern Virginia, where he went to James Madison High School. And he tells me the story about how he attended Vienna Elementary School and remembers how a teacher pulled him aside and taught him how to read and write and speak English because, he was as I like to call, one of the original dreamers. He didn't speak the language. He didn't know how to read and write English. But somebody at that school was patient enough and kind enough to show him the way. There was a Presbyterian church in Vienna, Virginia, that gave my dad and my grandmother coats and sweaters so they could stay warm in their first winter, I should say, in Washington, D.C., away from Cuba. And I talk about some of this in the book, mainly because I think, it's a reminder of the immigrant experience that I think a lot of us collectively have in this country, which is that immigrants are good for the United States of America. They make positive contributions to this country. As I write in the book, it's part of what makes America America. And I guess I've banged into some folks over the White House on this particular issue. You'll recall Stephen Miller, the domestic policy advisor to the president, as I lay out in the book, one of the architects of the president's immigration policy. He and I had that back and forth in the White House briefing room in August of 2017 over their intent to change the nation's legal immigration system. They wanted to, at the time, reduce it by 50%. And as I said to Stephen in the briefing room that day, what about what's etched on the Statue of Liberty? Give us your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. And he said, well, Jim, that has nothing to do with the Statue of Liberty. The Statue of Liberty is not about immigration. And I said, hang on a second, Stephen. He did say that. I'm glad you're laughing because you recognize it as being BS too. But I said to Stephen, that's national park revisionism. If you go on the national park website for the Statue of Liberty, the Statue of Liberty is described as the immigrant statue. And I always like to talk about this because I want folks to go and look at that website before they change it. And it shows pictures of immigrants showing up on America's shores, Irish, Germans, Italians, folks who came during that generation to this country. And they helped build this country. And I think that immigrants coming to this country now have that same kind of experience. But the reason why I talk about this with Stephen Miller is not just because of the immigrant experience in this country, but because Stephen was trying to do something in that briefing room that I've encountered time and again as a White House correspondent for CNN, and that is trying to tell the American people something that isn't so. And we've seen that from the President of the United States, as I talk about in the book. The President of the United States, recently found by the Washington Post, has uttered 10,000 false or misleading statements since coming into office. That was the conclusion of the Washington Post fact checker. That has made us fact checkers in real time. So we spend a lot of our time and energy fact checking the president, making sure that the American people have accurate, reliable information. And as I've been saying to folks lately, what in the world would our country be like right now if you didn't have the press fact-checking the president? What would be our sense of reality? What would our sense of the truth be if the press wasn't doing its job? And I know that the president, his team, some of his supporters get very upset about this. They see this as us giving the president a hard time. But the way I describe it is, in this business these days, we're not just here to report the news, we're here to defend the truth. And I think we've got to keep doing that. Now, one of the other things that I talk about in the book is the way that the president has lashed out at us. Many of you may not recall this, perhaps some of you do, but during the campaign of 2016, the president, then candidate Trump, referred to us as the disgusting news media, the dishonest news media, called us liars, scum, thieves. I'm thinking of all of the things that he called us at that time, but he rolled this act into the Oval Office and called us fake news, called me fake news, and then the enemy of the people. But it's interesting to note, I think some of this started off as an act. Some of this started off as a way to trigger the news media, taunt and troll the news media so we would chase the bright, shiny objects. I'll tell you a story that's in the book. Hope Hicks, one of the president's top advisors, on the same day that the president called me very fake news at a press conference in February of 2017, calls me and she goes, Jim, I just want you to know, I was, hi, Hope, how are you? Jim, I just want you to know that the president thought you were very professional today. And the president said, Jim gets it. And I'm thinking to myself, wait a minute, he just went off on me over here and called me very fake news, and then somebody on his team calls me not too long after that and says, Jim gets it. He was very professional. So I think, and I talked to a number of other advisors and sources who said, yeah, this is pretty much an act. It's kind of like The Apprentice, you're fired, you're fake news, same kind of deal. The problem is that not everybody is in on the act. And I talk about this in the book. There are folks, and people may not want to believe this, but I think that the majority of Trump supporters out there are good people. They care about this country. They're invested in this president. I get that. But there are some folks who describe themselves as Trump supporters who have lashed out at us in ways that make us feel endangered. And the owner here just talked about what happened in October of 2018 before the midterms last year, when a self-described Trump supporter sent a pipe bomb to CNN and various Democratic officials around the country. For a lot of us, it felt like a culmination of these threats that have been building up over time. And, as I write in the book, the question is, where do things go from here? Do we want to live in a country where the press is referred to as the enemy of the people? How does it get worse from that? A pipe bomb being sent to CNN. As I talk about in the book, I've been on the receiving end of a variety of death threats coming into my social media accounts, my email, and so on. And, this has made my life pretty difficult at times. And I don't want to say, hey, I'm the only one here. A lot of my colleagues in the press, reporters, anchors who cover this president have experienced the same thing. I was just meeting with my friend April Ryan earlier today, who works for American Urban Radio. And she used to say that she had the FBI on speed dial because she had been on the receiving end of so much of this hostility. And the question that I have for folks is this the kind of country we want to hand off to the next generation? As I've been saying to folks lately, and I'm hoping I'll see some heads nod here when I say this, I remember growing up in this country with our parents and our grandparents saying they want to leave to us, the next generation, a better country than the one they found. Anybody ever hear that anymore? Do we say that anymore? I think that we have to start thinking deeply about all of this. Are we handing off to the next generation a better country if it's okay and acceptable for the President of the United States to refer to the press or any segment of American society as the enemy of the people? I would challenge you. I hope I'm staying in my lane as a straight news reporter when I say this. I don't believe that is taking us down the right path. And I hope that when folks read this book, that they think deeply about this and perhaps have some second thoughts about whether or not all of this is a good idea. Not to drone on too long here. You've been very patient listening to me. I'll be happy to take some questions from you all. And unlike some people, I won't yell at you. I won't call you any names. You can ask me questions. I'll try to give you a straight answer. And I'm sure you'll ask about all sorts of things. So I'm happy to take your question. And thanks for listening to that.
First question, Jim. We've seen how the president and Sarah Sanders treat you. How do you not just lose your mind sometimes?
Okay. Well, according to some of my critics, I already have. But, I try to relieve the stress in a variety of ways. I've become quite an avid runner now. I do that whether I've slept or not the night before, which may not always be the case. And it helps relieve stress and tension. But listen, the way I look at it is that this is, I've got a job to do. And it's not personal for me. People might say, I was on the Hugh Hewitt show earlier this morning. He says, it sounds like you hate the president. I don't hate anybody. But I do think there is a problem here when we're trying to do our jobs, hold their feet to the fire, hold them accountable on behalf of the taxpayers, and we get called names like fake news and the enemy of the people. I don't mind being called names, but I don't like being put into an environment. I don't like my colleagues being put in an environment where people feel endangered or threatened. And I just think that that's, as I say throughout the book, I've covered 4 different presidential campaigns. This is the second administration that I've covered at the White House. This hasn't happened before. I haven't seen anything like this before at this level. And so we need to think deeply about this and raise some questions as to whether or not this kind of thing should continue. But I haven't lost my mind yet. Don't worry. I'm hanging in there.
Next question. Are you glad that Sarah is gone?
Oh, gosh. Good night, everybody. Thanks for coming. I appreciate your time. Take another sip to think about that one. Here's my sense of it. You know, this is a tough job, the job of White House press secretary, and the job doesn't have a long shelf life. Jay Carney, Josh Earnest, the press secretaries for Barack Obama, they spent about 2 years on the job before they moved on to other things, and it is a stressful environment. But I do think, and this was the case with Sarah, and I think also the case with Sean Spicer, her predecessor, I think what happened with both of them is that they lost sight of who they work for. I think they acted as spokespersons for the Trump organization or Donald J. Trump and not the American people. And when you are the press secretary for the White House, you're sort of the press secretary for the United States of America. And I think they lost sight of that at times. I really do. You know, in the Mueller report, it is stated that Sarah Sanders admitted to federal prosecutors that she knowingly passed on false information at a White House briefing when it came to her explanation, the administration's explanation as to why the president fired James Comey. She knowingly passed on false information. That is now preserved and memorialized in the Mueller report. That's not me saying it. That's her. And Sean Spicer, when he came in as the press secretary on the first full day of the administration, we all remember this. I was sitting there right there in the front row of the briefing room, walked right into the White House briefing room and, you know, just uttered the biggest whopper I had ever seen. And I just remember just my jaw dropping and, you know, just like, wow. He came in here and said that Donald Trump had the largest inauguration crowd in the history of the country. And I was out on the front lawn, and I talk about this in the book. I was on the front lawn of the White House, the north lawn of the White House on Inauguration Day, and I remember seeing the empty stands. I remember seeing those pictures on the news. And so, and having covered Barack Obama's first 2 inaugurations, you know, you can do a comparison and contrast. It doesn't take a smart guy or even somebody like me to figure out that, you know, this was a different crowd size number. And from the very beginning, I think, you know, there was a certain amount of credibility that was shot, and we saw that continue on throughout this administration. And you can't just go into the White House briefing room and do this sort of thing. My goodness, we have seen White House press secretaries in the past, BS us and spin us and sidestep questions and so on. But I don't know. I don't think we've seen it at this level. My sense of it is we have not seen it at this level. And my hope is that the next press secretary who comes in, and maybe I'm being Pollyannish or naive about this, but my hope is that the next press secretary who comes in understands that that person works for the American people. And I hear people saying, no, they don't think so. But you got to have hope, you know.
Okay, this next question refers to that now infamous news conference. When the intern tried to take your microphone away,
right.
Did that shock you? Was that unusual behavior for a briefing?
Yeah. It's never happened to me before. I've never had somebody come after my microphone before. And somebody was saying, wait a minute, it's not your microphone, it's the White House's microphone. Well, I did help pay for that microphone. My tax dollars went to the purchase of that microphone, if I may say so. But, you know, I don't blame the intern who came to do that. She was just doing her job. She was doing what the White House told her to do. I feel badly that she was put in that position. But you know, as you saw in that video, I went back like this and was like, whoa, what's happening here? And the saddest part of that whole spectacle for me was later on that night, and I talk about this in the book. You know, I did my thing that afternoon, was on Wolf Blitzer, went to go get my dinner. I came back and I have my phone in my hand, and I look at the phone and there's this notification there that says that my press pass had been revoked. It wasn't the White House contacting me individually to say this. It was a statement blasted out to the whole White House press corps and to news outlets everywhere. And I said, wow, okay, this is getting serious here. And, you know, I recorded the video because I thought, you know, if this ever happens, I better document this. And so I recorded the video, and you can see in the video me handing my press pass off to the Secret Service officer. And I was trying to be very professional, and sir, I don't blame you. Here you go. And he said at one point, it looks like it's been in this lanyard for a while. Was having a tough time coming out. But then later on that night, I mean, something happened that just shocked me, and I feel like I've seen just about everything. When the press secretary tweeted out a doctored video of that moment, if they had a good case for the revocation of my hard pass, one would think they wouldn't need a doctored or altered video to prove it. And it turns out this video came from somebody associated with the website InfoWars, which I don't want to give a plug for those guys, but they don't have the best track record, obviously, of being anywhere near the truth in the same universe as the truth. And so at that point, CNN, listen, some news outlets might have wavered on this or gone wishy-washy. CNN was absolutely committed from that point forward to get my hard pass back, to get my press pass back. And it took a little while, but we went into court, and a Trump-appointed judge listened to both sides, and he called that video, he described it as being of questionable accuracy. I'll never forget that one. I was appreciative of that, and gave me back my press pass. Listen, one of the things that I write about in the book is that the stakes were pretty high at that point. If the White House had prevailed in that, I think there would have been a real chilling effect on the First Amendment and on the free press in this country. Keep in mind what the Justice Department's own lawyers were saying during our court case in federal court. And mind you, Justice Department lawyers who are paid for with your tax dollars, they made the argument that the President of the United States can pick and choose who covers the White House, that if he doesn't like the coverage that you are providing, if he doesn't like the story that you're doing, he can go up, their people can go up, tap you on the shoulder and say, hey, buddy, you're out of here. Now, what kind of world would we be living in? What kind of Washington, D.C. would this, I'm sure wouldn't resemble anything close to what you're used to or accustomed to here in Washington. It would have dramatically changed our business, because I think not only would future administrations have been able to look back and say, well, Donald Trump did this, we're going to do it too. Governors in states across the country, I think mayors in cities across the country could have said, well, look at what happened in the case of CNN versus Trump. We're going to do this too. We're going to get rid of reporters we don't like. And that just would have been an incredible chilling effect on the free press and on the First Amendment in this country. And I'm glad we prevailed. I'm glad we came out on top, because I think the stakes were pretty high.
So the next three questions all have a kind of a common theme,
Sure.
Which is, should news organizations now, after covering Trump as president for a while, begin to make some adjustments in the way he's covered? And the first of those questions is the media too quick to report everything Trump says and does?
It's a great question. And, we never really had this conversation before. Should you cover the president of the United States? Is that a good idea to cover the president? If the president says something, should you report on it? Okay. The question itself, I think, highlights a problem, right? And I think what we've grappled with since he's become president is just how do we cover this guy? And it's been a little bit of trial and error. I'll admit that right here and now. But I think we're getting savvier in terms of what he's doing. And I write about this in the book. His own people recognized that when he would go out there and say these outrageous and outlandish things, it would drive the news coverage. And, poor, Jeb Bush and Marco Rubio would be on the sideline saying, oh my goodness, we're not getting all this coverage here. And the Trump people behind the scenes noticed that. They said, okay, this works. And so it's no surprise that he kept doing this. Now people say, well, didn't you cover him too much? Remember, almost from the beginning of the primary process, he was the Republican frontrunner. So it's hard, like I said before, what about this idea of not covering the president? It's hard not to cover the Republican frontrunner. But I think what you're going to see moving forward is you're going to see less of a focus on covering these rallies end to end, and perhaps waiting to see what happens at the rally, reporting afterwards and saying, this is what the president got right, this is what the president got wrong, this was factually correct, this was factually incorrect. And maybe there's a whole bunch of things that are factually incorrect, and we'll have to go through all of those things. But I think that is something that I think you're going to see not only on our part, but across the industry going into the next campaign. And I think the American people will be better served for that.
So as a follow-on to that, is it possible for the entire news media to cease repeating Trump's nicknames for people.
I try my best not to do that, but please keep going. Yes, sir.
Especially with the upcoming election. It's demeaning,
Right.
it sticks, and it lends gravitas to bullying and pettiness and to totally unpresidential behavior.
That's a great question. And all throughout the Mueller investigation, just to pivot for a second, and then I'll come back to that, you saw a lot of the president's tweets where he talked about the Mueller probe being conducted by 18 angry Democrats. First, I think it was 13 angry Democrats, and by some point it became 18 angry Democrats. And as we tried to point out, Robert Mueller is a lifelong Republican. So wait a minute, hold on, that's not factually accurate. And then the person overseeing the investigation was Rod Rosenstein, also a Republican. So factually, that was not accurate. So when he would say that, put that in his tweets, I tried my darndest not to report that, not to put that on the air. This goes back to how we're getting a little bit more savvy in how to cover this guy. During the 2020 campaign, if he goes back to calling Joe Biden Sleepy Joe and so forth, I think you're going to see news outlets not taking that bait, not passing that on and playing that game, because I do agree we need to stick to the substance. And it does take time away from covering important issues like immigration, like the environment, like the economy. And so I think you're going to see a savvier press corps recognizing some of the patterns here. The dots are now coming into place. We're starting to connect them a little bit better than we did before. And I think that's going to be beneficial to the coverage.
And here's a suggestion. In an hour of broadcasting, say on CNN, why not separate all of Trump's tweets from the previous hour into a 5-minute segment and then never comment on them again?
Wow, who came up with that one? Raise your hand. You're hired. No, I'm just. Listen, we all can build a better mousetrap, I think. We're trying to do that as well. We just recently hired a guy from the Toronto Star, a guy named Daniel Dale, who the younger folks here tonight might recognize from Twitter. He knows Trump and what he says, I think, better than Donald Trump does. But he's come on board at CNN to be a fact checker, and he's going to be sort of our fact check guru. And I believe he's live tweeting the rally tonight and saying, that's not true, that's not true, okay, this might be half true, and so on. And I think folks are going to benefit from that. I really think it's going to enhance our coverage.
Like a medieval morality play, isn't it necessary to have a demon figure to activate the good?
Wow. What section of the bookstore do you shop in? Was that like a question from Dungeons and Dragons or something like that?
It's a thought question.
Wow, that is an interesting question. I think that sort of gets into an existential, philosophical discussion here. I mean, I suppose if I were to sit here and think deeply about this, I could give you a more sophisticated answer than the one I'm going to give you now. But I just see this as doing my job. I'm here to report the news, give folks the information that they need. People don't have a whole heck of a lot of time to sit there in front of the TV. We want you to do that as much as possible, but and so we have to make sure folks are getting the information, they're getting it quickly, and they're getting it accurately. And then when there's time, expand on things, do things, do some reporting in depth. We have a great investigative team. We have great foreign teams around the world who do excellent coverage on what's happening in Iran right now and what's happening down on the border. For example, these caravans and these migrations that are coming up towards the border that the president describes as an invasion. You want to talk about medieval. He calls it an invasion, and I keep thinking back to Game of Thrones, and I'm not seeing any catapults down there or anything like that. But no, I think that, I think that we're very serious about what we do. I don't see this as a morality play. I don't see myself as some sort of, Omarosa-style figure in Donald Trump's reality TV presidency. I see this, I'm doing my job here, and I feel very strongly about that. And getting back to the book, we've got to think really hard about this, whether or not we want this to be the kind of political system that we have moving forward. Do we want, celebrities being able to come out of the woodwork and just throw, chum into the water and dominate our political process? I don't think that's the kind of system that we want. we've got to get savvier, not just as journalists, but also as citizens and voters too. But I appreciate that question. Thank you. Thank you.
Here's an advice question. In today's climate, what advice would you give to the next generation of journalists who may be apprehensive about pursuing journalism?
I used to do talks like this, and I would tell young journalists, don't go into this business. This is a terrible business. You're going to miss your weekends and your holidays, and you're going to miss birthdays, and your parents are going to be mad at you, and your mother's going to say, why don't you call me enough, and that sort of thing. But I tell young journalists now, this is the best time that I've ever experienced to go into this business. We need, as I tell folks, we need reinforcements. We need folks to kind of relieve us when maybe we need a break from all of this. But no, I think that for young journalists who are coming up in this business, I think having a well-rounded, balanced diet of information, just like we put food in our bodies, we need a well-rounded diet of information that we consume on a daily basis. What I've noticed, and this is something that is, I think, quite alarming, is that we sort of have different medias now. We have the mainstream traditional media, the New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, the networks, and we have this whole other conservative media empire out there, Fox News and some of the websites that I don't want to give a plug to right now, but their footprint is starting to grow as large as the traditional mainstream media footprint and I would encourage young journalists who are getting into this business, as you're doing this, you might be attracted, you might be called by that siren song of, I just want to do the news according to my own point of view and do it for people who share my point of view. I think if you want to be a journalist, you need to try to go down that traditional mainstream route, learn this trade as I tried to do. I came up, as you were mentioning, through local news. I worked in Knoxville, Tennessee, and Dallas and Chicago. Actually, my very first TV job was here at Channel 5 in Washington, and I made $4.25 an hour. I had no health benefits. Sam Donaldson's wife was a reporter at the station, and he would call up and ask, "Can I speak to Jan Smith, please? I want to speak to my wife." Mr. Donaldson, hang on a second. I don't want to hang up on you. Hang on. But I sort of learned from the bottom up, and that's a long roundabout way of saying I think that's beneficial to people in this business. If you learn from the bottom up, you learn all of these different jobs along the way, and I think it makes you a better reporter. There's some folks who come out of college now, they just put me on the network. I want to be on the network right now. But I think there's something to be said for learning as you grow as a journalist in this business.
Ready for a hypothetical?
Sure.
Do you believe if Trump loses in November 2020 that we will have a peaceful transfer of power in January 2021?
This is my next good night, everybody. No. It's interesting that question keeps coming up. Again, it's one of those questions that maybe speaks volumes more so than what the answer might be. But, Michael Cohen said that at his hearing. Remember that up on Capitol Hill? Michael Cohen raised doubts as to whether or not Trump would yield power if he loses. My sense of it is that he's going to run into something called the Constitution, and the Constitution is going to say you only get 2 terms if he makes it to a second term. But what is alarming to me is this trend of delegitimizing the information that we receive. He's gone from fake news to fake polls, and my question is, what's next? Fake election results? Is that what we're going to hear next? And I think Americans better be on guard for that. I think as journalists, we're going to be on guard for that. People calling into question the outcome of this upcoming election. I think that is going to be a very serious challenge for this country if that happens. And what you're going to need at that point, and I talk about this in the book, because we didn't see a whole lot of that during the first 2 years of the administration, that is when we're going to see perhaps the ultimate test for the Republican Party here in this country. It'll be a historic moment. If the President of the United States does not yield to election results, does not say, okay, I lost, I'm out of here, what will the Republican Party do? It will be, I think, a pretty seminal moment in this country.
Here's a question about July 4th.
Oh, wow, yes. I know where this is going.
What do you suggest for those of us who like to head downtown for the 4th of July? Do we stay home?
You like fireworks, huh?
Do we stay home? Do we stay away from the Lincoln Memorial? Do we protest?
Interesting. Well, I can't advocate whether or not there should be a protest, but I remember growing up in this area. Maybe there might be a few folks here who were around back then, but we had the Beach Boys down on the mall, and that was anybody. I guess people do remember that. Okay, that was a lot of fun. Remember that? Can we get those guys back? I think that it is going to be interesting to watch if he decides to politicize America's birthday down on the National Mall. We don't need the president to come in and hug the flag for us to all feel good about America on July the 4th. My sense of it is that he is a savvy, smart politician. He may not have been in this business for very long, but I think he knows what he's doing. And the question is whether or not, and perhaps this question will be raised, is whether or not the National Mall can be used for a political event like that, especially on Independence Day. I think the verdict is out on that one. We'll have to see how it all plays out. But we'll be covering it no matter what happens down there, and the fireworks will go off, I imagine, no matter what. So we'll see.
A couple more questions, Jim.
Sure.
In your coverage of Trump, what are you proudest of, and what do you regret most?
Wow, what do I regret most? I think it is. I think it's regrettable, and I talked about this before. Where we are as a country right now, and I mean this, and this is why I wrote this book. We can't have a situation in this country where we're ripping each other to shreds. And I did an event up in New York recently, and Dan Rather was there, and he and I were talking about my book, and he asked me to read a portion from the book. Out of the whole book that he had read, he wanted me to read a portion from it where I talk about how to get out of this mess, I think we're going to have to start having a little more faith in one another. And that means, dare I say, perhaps having a little more faith in the person in the red MAGA hat. And to the other side, having a little more faith in perhaps the lady in the pink resist T-shirt. We can't keep going down this road where it's so hyper-partisan that we don't trust one another and we don't trust the information that we're receiving. That, I think, is a road we don't want to go down. And I think that is regrettable. Now, in terms of my own personal reporting and what I've done, listen, I mean, if I had to do it all over again, I think I would do it the exact same way. My sense of it is that this is an unprecedented challenge for our country. We've never had a president in my lifetime, and I would say, in our country's history, where the president has consistently, the president of the United States, remember, the United States government has consistently regarded the press as the enemy of the people. And if you care about free speech, if you care about freedom of the press, if you care about the First Amendment, I hope you'll buy this book, because that is the message at the heart of this book. Without free speech, without freedom of the press, where are we as a democracy? Where are we as a country? And as you were saying and quoting me, and I'll quote you quoting me, a different kind of president calls for a different kind of playbook for journalists and for citizens. And when the president of the United States utters 10,000 false or misleading statements, it might take more than one crack at asking the question to get at something resembling the truth. And that has made our jobs tough. But I can speak on my behalf, but I think I can speak on the behalf of my colleagues to say that we're very committed to this job. We see this as a very serious time, and we are dedicated to, and it may sound corny to folks, we are dedicated to the truth. As reporters these days, we're not just here to report the news, we're here to defend the truth. And I guess I'm most proud of that too. So.
Last question is kind of a process question, because you're now an author, a debut author. What was the process like of writing this book? Where did you find the time?
Wow.
How'd you go about it?
I know people have asked me that question, which I appreciate that. That means that folks have a perception that I've been working hard and that I don't have time to write a book, which is good. Please tell all my bosses that. That's wonderful. It's funny. During the campaign, people would come up to me and say, "You should really write a book about this. This is unbelievable what's happening here." And then Donald Trump became president, and people said, "You should really write a book about this. This is unbelievable." And so along the way, there have been episodes and things like the Hicks story and so on that didn't quite fit into the news of the day or the reporting of that day, but I've been kind of storing up anecdotes and observations and talking to sources and so on. And from that, I try to weave together a narrative here that explains what we've been going through over the past couple of years. And, I've been on airplanes and at airports, on weekends and early mornings and late at night, writing this thing. And one of the things that's been most gratifying to me, I talk from time to time about, some of the uglier side of things that I've experienced. But I must say, and perhaps the crowd that is here tonight speaks to that, I must say I've been so overwhelmed. As a kid who had a single mom growing up and a dad who was a Cuban refugee, I did not think I would ever be at this place in my life. And I am enormously grateful to all of the people who have come up to me and my colleagues over the last couple of years and have said, hang in there, hang tough. I was flying back from Argentina after the G20 summit, and I woke up on the plane, and the flight attendant had left a note from the pilot saying, keep going, don't stop. Keep fighting for the truth. And I said, wait a minute, who's flying the plane? But anyway, he was flying it. But, people have come, folks from an immigrant background have come up to me and said, thank you for standing up for immigrants in this country and standing up for the truth in this country. I do believe, and this again goes back to maybe a little bit of a corniness thing on my part, I do believe that we're all in this together. I do believe that we're all on the same team. And as I've been saying lately, I am not your enemy. You are not my enemy. We are not the enemy of the people. We are defenders of the people. And I hope that when we leave this event here tonight, if you know some folks out there who may not have a whole lot of faith in what we're doing, that you'll try again and keep trying, because we got to figure out how to get out of this mess. We can't keep going down this road. We got to remind ourselves we are still on the same team. Thank you. And thank you all for coming tonight. I appreciate it.